I remember arriving at Christchurch Cathedral on a morning draped in mist, when the stones seemed to sigh beneath the weight of centuries. The rain had left the pavement slick, and the smell of wet lime mingled with the faint, lingering incense from the evening service. I had no particular case in mind, only the habitual urge to wander, to observe, to allow the city to whisper its secrets. Yet in the choir's shadowed nave, something felt out of rhythm, as though the very air had learned a dissonant note and was reluctant to release it. The choir was practicing, the soprano voices clear and precise, weaving over the low resonance of the organ. I lingered near the back, half hidden by a column, and let the music unfold, observing more than listening, as is my custom. There is a clarity in the visual, the tilt of a head, the pressure of fingers against sheet music that often carries a truth the ear cannot decipher alone. One young soprano in particular caught my attention, though not for her singing. She seemed to hover at the edges, eyes darting, hands brushing the stand, as if to steady herself from some invisible tremor. On a polished mahogany music stand tucked beneath a dusty motte was a newspaper clipping. The headline was small, understated, "Eleanor Fane found dead." My eyes lingered on the photograph, and I found myself tracing the contours of her face, the careful parting of her hair, the faint shadow of a smile that suggested, if anything, defiance against the world rather than compliance. I tucked the clipping away in my coat, though I could feel the faint scuff of it against the fabric, as though it already bore some weight. The master of music spoke in a measured voice, commenting on phrasing, timing, the subtle swells that distinguish the ordinary from the transcendent. I nodded silently, not because I was unaware, but because the sound of his voice seemed to camouflage the tension, to render it ordinary. And yet I noticed small things, a misaligned page in the soprano's score, the way she avoided glancing at a particular boy whose gaze lingered too long, the sudden, almost imperceptible falter in her breath during the alto's entrance. The mind of a detective moves not like a musician, in crescendo and cadence, but in the pauses between the subtle rests where meaning is withheld. I wandered later along the aisles, trailing my fingers along the worn stone, imagining the footsteps of centuries, the silent liturgies repeated in near-identical devotion. There is a melancholy in such repetition, a beauty in the consistency of human imperfection. And there, in the quietest corner, a discarded rehearsal diary caught my attention. One page was missing, ripped neatly, as though someone had anticipated my curiosity. I remembered an old crossword clue once about a missing key that unlocks the door, and for a moment the analogy was not lost on me. Outside the bells tolled, low and resonant, marking the hour with a solemnity that seemed almost directed at me. I stood beneath the stone arches, feeling the damp seep into my coat, the persistent ache of solitude pressing upon my chest. The cathedral offered no answers, only echoes, the hollow resonance of music, of absence, of human frailty. I noted the scent of rain-washed stone, the distant scraping of a choirboy's shoes, the quiet sob of a page turning. In that moment I understood something both ordinary and terrible. The world had shifted in some imperceptible way, and Eleanor Fane's absence was more than the loss of a soprano. It was a tremor beneath the familiar, a discord that demanded attention. I made a silent promise to follow it wherever it led, knowing that in Oxford every shadow has its story, and every story carries the weight of a question yet unanswered. And so I lingered, listening to the last notes of the motet, allowing the silence to speak, and feeling for the first time that a melody can mourn as effectively as any human voice. I returned to the choir school the following morning, rain still lingering in the hollows of Oxford's stone streets, the mist refracting the light so that the towers seemed to waver as if in a dream. The school was quiet, corridors echoing with footsteps that had learned to soften against the parquet floors. I made my way to the music master's office, noting the faint scent of rosin and waxed wood, the slightly musty aroma of scores long untouched. He greeted me with a polite, guarded expression, and I felt immediately the tension in the room, a pressure invisible yet insistent, like the stillness before a chord resolves. He spoke first of Eleanor Fane's diligence, of her punctuality and grace in rehearsals, but the hesitancy in his phrasing suggested an unease he could not entirely conceal. I observed his hands, folded on the desk, noting a small tremor as he replaced a pen he had absent-mindedly rotated, and remembered the briefest of gestures often holds more truth than elaborate statements. He mentioned her diary, which he had not seen since the night before her death. I allowed him to speak, watching for the flickers in his eyes, the slight tilt of his head that betrayed worry, embarrassment, or perhaps guilt. The young soprano from the previous day was present in the rehearsal room, flitting from chair to chair with restless energy. I noted how she avoided certain individuals, particularly a boy with an old violin who lingered in doorways, as if half-willing to witness something he might later regret. There was a pause in her steps when she passed the music stand where the newspaper clipping had lain. I sensed a subtle recognition, a shadow of fear or recollection, though she spoke nothing. These silences, I reminded myself, often carry the weight of unspoken truths. I asked casually about the missing diary page. He admitted it had vanished, either removed deliberately or mislaid, but the phrasing of his admission implied he did not believe it. Significant. I made a mental note, recalling an old crossword clue I once wrestled with. Absence is sometimes the loudest statement. It seemed now that Eleanor's disappearance, like the missing page, was not a simple accident, but part of a pattern I could not yet articulate. I walked among the practice rooms, the high ceilings amplifying the faintest hum of breath and string. A piano stood slightly out of tune, an imperfection unnoticed by the novices but visible to someone with a careful ear. I traced the subtle scuff marks on the floor, noting the rhythm of movement, the habitual paths of those who frequented the space. There was a whisper of perfume here, the faintest trace of a handkerchief folded and left behind, and I considered that such minor details might one day reveal a narrative more compelling than any confession. Later, I examined the music scores more closely. A few pages had been turned repeatedly, edges softening under invisible fingers. In one copy, a minor chord progression had been circled lightly in pencil, almost imperceptible, as if highlighting a hidden emphasis. I wondered if Eleanor had discovered something, perhaps a secret embedded in the music, a message or a warning that prompted anxiety in those around her. I made note of the pattern, suspecting that a careful study of these annotations might illuminate what otherwise remained hidden. By midday, the rehearsal concluded. I observed the choir as they left the room, noting a lingering glance, a tightened jaw, a hand brushing a sleeve absent-mindedly. Such gestures, so easily overlooked, seemed to flicker in importance, suggesting alliances, resentments, or fear. I felt again that the surface of ordinary life here was merely a veneer over currents of jealousy, ambition, and perhaps shame. I stepped outside, the drizzle falling lightly, the streets glistening. Oxford's quiet grandeur seemed unchanged, yet I sensed beneath it a resonance of absence, the echo of Eleanor's missing voice stretching through the corridors and stone. I understood, with a small tightening in my chest, that this was the beginning of an inquiry that would demand patience, attention, and a willingness to listen to what was not spoken. The melody had fractured, and somewhere in that fracture, the truth waited. The cloisters were damp, their flagstones slick from an overnight drizzle, and the arches cast long, trembling shadows that seemed to flicker with memory. I moved slowly, tracing the familiar contours of stone walls I had walked countless times, each step a whisper against the silence. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and aged paper, and somewhere distant the muffled scrape of a broom suggested the ordinary persisted, even as I felt the subtle disruption Eleanor Fane's absence had introduced. I encountered the young organist near the chapter house, adjusting stops with meticulous care, his brow furrowed not only from concentration, but from something he seemed reluctant to articulate. I noted the rhythm of his movements, the way his fingers lingered on certain keys, the almost imperceptible hesitation when I asked about Eleanor's last rehearsal. He mentioned her punctuality, her disciplined attention, yet avoided any direct comment on her sudden disappearance. There was an understated tension in his posture, a shadow of resentment perhaps, or the residue of an unspoken grievance. Further along the cloisters I noticed a visiting musicologist leaning against the stonework, observing the subtle interactions of staff and students. He was a man whose age and manner lent authority, but whose eyes betrayed curiosity, sharpened by a prior intimacy with secrets. He spoke of Eleanor's remarkable talent and the scholarly promise she had exhibited, yet I could detect a shade of ambiguity in the choice of words, a measured reserve. There is, I have often observed, a deliberate pause before truth that signals either caution or concealment. A casual glance revealed an anomaly. A carved bench at the far end, its surface scraped as though someone had tested the sharpness of a knife or perhaps the edge of a nerve. I crouched, noting the pattern of scratches, the faint imprint of a shoe sole, and the way moss had begun to claim the margins. The gesture was minor, almost invisible to most, yet it flickered in my mind like a faint motif in an unfinished symphony. Something here was deliberate, yet its meaning remained tantalizingly out of reach. I recalled a small photograph of the choir from the previous term, slightly blurred, a boy's hand positioned awkwardly on a music stand. Comparing it in my mind with the current scene, I wondered if the placement of the benches, the students' habitual routes, and the lingering presence of certain staff could constitute a silent language code in gesture, posture, and alignment. Such details, trivial in isolation, often illuminate what is otherwise concealed. Passing beneath the arches, I overheard fragments of conversation. The verger spoke quietly to a junior singer, referencing a rehearsal that had not taken place, and an unseen tension threaded through their words. I observed the soprano's reaction, the subtle shift of weight, the tightening of her hands, the faint avoidance of eye contact with the organist. It was a minor cue, yet in it lay the echo of an uncomfortable truth, a reminder that human behavior often betrays itself in hesitation. I wandered to the cloister garden, where the faint scent of damp foliage mingled with the faintest trace of perfume. I noted the direction of a recent footpath, the compressed grass, suggesting someone had lingered, perhaps watching, perhaps waiting. The musicologist had vanished, leaving behind only the faint impression of his coat on a stone balustrade. I felt, as I often do in such spaces, that absence can be as informative as presence, that shadows conceal, yet also reveal. By mid-afternoon, the sun broke, weakly through a patch of clouds, casting lattice-like shadows across the path. I paused to examine a scrap of paper, half buried under the leaves, noting a cryptic pencil marking an initial, a symbol, almost imperceptible. It recalled an old crossword clue, one whose solution depended on noticing what was not there. I pocketed it carefully, sensing that such small fragments might one day converge into a narrative coherent enough to account for Eleanor's disappearance. As I retraced my steps, the cloisters seemed to hum with residual tension, a subtle discord beneath the surface of everyday routine. The interplay of light and shadow, gesture and silence, had become a language I was compelled to translate. Somewhere among these arches, in the habitual movements of the choir and the unspoken glances of those who remained, the first outlines of a truth were beginning to emerge, delicate and elusive as the final note of a motet fading into air. I remember sitting in the quiet corner of the Bodleian, the scent of old paper and the faint trace of leather bindings wrapping around me like a cloak. The rain tapped lightly against the tall windows, a rhythm that seemed both ordinary and urgent. Eleanor Fane's notes lay spread before me, a collection of delicate sheets, some scrawled in her precise hand, others inscribed with cryptic symbols that suggested a cipher. I traced the lines slowly, allowing the letters and the spaces between them to breathe. It is often in the intervals, the pauses between meaning, that truth reveals itself. The first sheet seemed mundane, a rehearsal schedule, annotated with shorthand and musical markings. Yet as I compared the notes to the scores I had examined in the choir rooms, patterns began to emerge, minor motifs repeated, subtle shifts in phrasing that might signify more than mere preference. I recalled a crossword clue I had once struggled over, the answer hidden in what was left unsaid. Perhaps here too the message was not in the letters themselves, but in their deliberate omission. One symbol recurred, a small triangle at the margin of each page. At first, I thought it was merely a notation of emphasis, but the placement in the text, aligned with particular words in a poem Eleanor had copied from Milton, suggested otherwise. The letters adjacent to the triangles seemed to spell fragments of a sentence, though the syntax remained elusive. I leaned back, letting the dim light of the library filter through the windows, and considered that the mind, when pressed by secrecy or fear, leaves clues in the most discreet forms. A few of the notes were more personal, intimate reflections on her rehearsals, the attitudes of colleagues, the faintest hints of disapproval. The phrasing was careful, controlled, yet I detected a slight shift in tone when she mentioned the organist. The sentences were punctuated differently, commas where one would expect full stops, an almost imperceptible hesitation in rhythm. Such subtlety often betrays anxiety or suspicion, and I filed the observation away for later, when the constellation of evidence might come into focus. I noticed one page had been folded repeatedly, its edges softened, and when I unfolded it fully, a series of letters appeared arranged diagonally across the margins. My eye followed them slowly, tracing each connection. A secondary message revealed itself, a warning perhaps, though the meaning remained just beyond my grasp. The placement of the notes suggested deliberate concealment, a silent insistence that they be discovered only by someone patient enough to read between lines, between chords, between breaths. There was also a trivial, almost mundane detail, a smudge of ink at the bottom right corner of a page. I had seen such smudges before, often indicating a hurried hand, a nervous impulse. Yet here the smudge aligned with the diagonal letters, as though marking an intended starting point for deciphering. A faint thrill of recognition moved through me. The most minor gestures sometimes carry the weight of entire confessions. Later, I revisited the musical annotations, overlaying them with the coded symbols. Certain phrases are repeated, corresponding with Eleanor's commentary about rehearsals and rehearsed voices. There was a meticulousness to her arrangement, as if the music itself were a key to human behavior, a cipher for understanding intention. I thought of how a misplaced note in a composition could alter the perception of an entire passage, just as a subtle gesture could change the tone of a conversation. By the time the library emptied, shadows had deepened along the tall shelves. I traced a final connection between a pencil marking in a music score and a sequence in Eleanor's notes, a subtle line drawn connecting two otherwise unrelated words. I realized, as I often do in these investigations, that the smallest observation, overlooked annotation, a seemingly trivial smudge, a hesitation in phrasing, might one day illuminate the architecture of an entire mystery. I left the Bodleian with the rain softened to a drizzle, carrying the notes carefully, aware that Eleanor's voice, though absent, had left a resonance. The coded pages hinted at rivalries, suspicions, and alliances as delicate as the motifs in a motet. And somewhere, within the arrangement of her thoughts and the margins of her life, a truth waited patiently, demanding recognition by a mind willing to read beyond what was offered, to linger in the silences, and to follow the music wherever it might lead. The day was unusually bright for late autumn, though the chill of the Thames air followed me through Oxford's narrow streets like an uninvited companion. I found myself wandering toward the faculty buildings, the kind of place where stone steps and worn railings carry the memory of countless lectures, private conversations, and minor betrayals. There was a quiet resonance in the architecture, a rhythm that suggested order and propriety, yet beneath it I could sense the intersections of ambition, rivalry, and fragile egos in an invisible lattice connecting those involved in Eleanor Fane's life. I began with the visiting opera coach, a man whose manner was both urbane and rehearsed, as though each gesture had been studied for dramatic effect. He spoke of Eleanor's technique, her promise, and her remarkable ear for phrasing. Yet there was a subtle hesitation when I inquired about her interactions with the organist. He had noted a growing tension between them, he said, though he framed it with the careful neutrality of a man unwilling to take sides. I noticed his hands briefly tremble as he smoothed the cuff of his sleeve, a small involuntary movement that suggested his narrative, however controlled, was not the entire truth. Next, I sought out the cathedral verger, who maintained a calm exterior, but whose eyes betrayed a depth of curiosity that could easily shade into suspicion. He offered little beyond a recitation of schedules and duties, yet a minor inconsistency caught my attention. The times he attributed to the choir's rehearsals did not align perfectly with Eleanor's personal notes. The discrepancy was slight, a matter of minutes, yet, as any crossword enthusiast knows, the smallest misalignment can alter the solution entirely. I filed it away, sensing that even trivialities might one day coalesce into clarity. I moved among the corridors, observing students and faculty as they passed. The young soprano lingered near the library entrance, glancing frequently at a colleague whose demeanor suggested both pride and irritation. I noted the angle of her shoulders, the subtle tightening of her hands when he entered the room. Such minor gestures are rarely conscious, yet they reveal the contours of human tension. I recalled an old insight: a shadow of hesitation is often the most revealing of truths. In the library, I found an overlooked ledger recording donations to the choir. The entries were neat, precise, almost mundane. Yet when I compared them with Eleanor's notes, I noticed small withdrawals that coincided with her last week's anonymous contributions that did not reconcile with the official accounts. The pattern was not yet alarming, but it suggested motives buried beneath the veneer of generosity. I traced the lines with my finger, imagining the hands that had touched the pages, the quiet deliberation behind each entry. I paused at a window overlooking the courtyard, watching students move between buildings with the rhythmic certainty of habit. I imagined their alliances, petty conflicts, and unspoken rivalries intersecting like musical lines in a complex fugue. Even the faculty, in their polite debates and scholarly critiques, formed part of this lattice, a network of observation and influence that shaped Eleanor's final days more profoundly than anyone might suspect. Later, I returned to the music room to revisit the scores and notes. The organist had left a folder slightly askew, a detail that initially seemed inconsequential. But when I aligned it with Eleanor's annotations, a subtle connection emerged. A sequence of rehearsed pieces had been marked differently in her notes than in the official schedule. The divergence was minor, a matter of phrasing and emphasis, yet it flickered with significance, suggesting that someone had manipulated appearances, perhaps to mask an encounter or an intention. By dusk, the corridors and cloisters were quiet once more, the faint scent of wet stone and wood smoke lingering in the air. I understood that these intersections, the points where paths, gestures, and intentions crossed, were crucial. Eleanor's disappearance was not the result of a single act, but a complex weave of ambition, secrecy, and subtle coercion. And somewhere within that intricate lattice, the faintest clue awaited discovery, a detail that would eventually illuminate the shadows with quiet precision. I remember returning to the cathedral late one afternoon, the sun slanting through the arched windows and setting the dust motes alight like tiny constellations. The air smelled faintly of damp stone and candle wax, and the quiet hum of the city beyond the cloisters seemed almost an afterthought. I carried with me Eleanor Fane's annotated scores and notes, turning them over in my mind like a puzzle whose pieces refused to settle. There was a particular minor chord in D minor that recurred across several pages. It was not unusual musically, yet its repetition in her personal markings suggested a significance beyond mere harmonic preference. I placed the score on the organ bench and pressed the keys lightly, letting the chord linger, sensing its melancholic weight. It struck me that music, like human behavior, carries hidden motives and subtle intimations. The minor key had a gravity, a tension that seemed to mirror Eleanor's recent anxieties. I reflected that a single, misplayed note in a melody can distort perception entirely, much as a small gesture can distort the truth of a statement. The organist appeared then, not entirely unexpected, lingering near the doorway with an expression that combined irritation and something unreadable. He offered a polite greeting, noting the hours of rehearsal and the challenges of tuning. I observed his hands, the slight wear at the fingertips, the faint smudge of pencil graphite, the minor details that speak volumes when one knows where to look. I inquired casually about Eleanor's last practices, and he mentioned an unusual insistence on the D minor passages, claiming she had found something subtle within them. His eyes flickered briefly when I asked what exactly, a hesitation that suggested either evasion or uncertainty. I wandered among the choir stalls, noting the impression of soles in the dust, the way a particular bench had been moved slightly out of line. A discarded metronome lay on its side, its pendulum frozen at a fraction of a beat. I recalled a small clue from Eleanor's coded notes, a diagonal line of symbols that seemed almost musical in its arrangement. The correlation between the symbols and the marked D minor passages suggested that her annotations were more than a reflection on technique. They were a code, an attempt to map some concealed truth onto the familiar structure of the music. Later, I revisited the ledger of donations, tracing entries that coincided with Eleanor's final rehearsals. Minor withdrawals, seemingly insignificant, now appeared to align with the sequences she had emphasized in her scores. There was a precision to the timing, a rhythm in her notes that corresponded with movements of both staff and students I had observed. The interplay of financial records and musical motifs hinted at an underlying design, as if Eleanor had intuited a hidden pattern in the world around her and sought to record it in the language she knew best. I paused at the lectern, noting a smudge of ink where Eleanor had underlined the chord repeatedly. Such a small detail, almost invisible, became significant in light of the patterns emerging elsewhere. The minor chord in D minor seemed to mark more than musical emphasis. It was an anchor for observation, a marker in time and intention. I considered the notion that a single motif can guide perception, much as a single, carefully placed gesture can illuminate hidden motives. By the time the shadows had lengthened across the nave, I had begun to perceive a faint structure connecting the music, the notes, and the subtle anomalies in behavior I had documented over the past weeks. The D minor passages, once simply melancholy, now suggested purpose and foresight, a coded message from Eleanor herself, expressing concern, fear, or perhaps warning in a language only someone attuned to her sensibilities could decipher. I left the cathedral with the faint echo of the organ still in my ears, aware that the minor chord, like the smallest human action, could hold the key to understanding not only what had happened, but why. The city outside was dimming in twilight, rain whispering against stone, and I felt again the quiet ache of pursuing truth in a world where the most delicate detail may illuminate the entire design. I remember the quiet of the library that afternoon, the scent of old leather, and the faint trace of chalk dust from a nearby lecture hall clinging to the air. The sun, low and hesitant behind Oxford's towers, cast a lattice of shadows across the polished wood floors. I was tracing Eleanor Fane's academic footsteps, moving from shelf to shelf, not in search of answers, but in pursuit of patterns, those quiet, almost imperceptible threads that might connect her disappearance to something long overlooked. A misfiled footnote in a rare musicology text caught my attention first. It referenced an earlier scandal within the cathedral's administration, something buried in the archives, its significance minimized in print. Eleanor had highlighted the reference, adding a marginal note in her careful, precise hand, a single word underlined, then circled. I felt the familiar thrill of recognition that the clue was small, almost trivial, yet it flickered with meaning. In crosswords, as in investigation, the smallest detail often illuminates the larger puzzle, provided one has the patience to observe. I traced her borrowing records, noting the books she had consulted in the weeks before her disappearance. Most were innocuous treatises on choral harmony, essays on Renaissance counterpoint, but a few titles stood out, particularly a volume on cathedral finances in the 19th century. Eleanor had placed a slip of paper as a bookmark, its corner peeking from between the pages. On it, she had jotted initials, a date, and a cryptic letter sequence. I felt that familiar shiver of anticipation the ordinary, when examined closely, often conceals the extraordinary. The photograph of the choir from the previous term came next. Something about the angle of Eleanor's head, the positioning of the organist's hand, and the slight tilt of another student's music stand seemed deliberately staged. I compared it with her notes, and a subtle incongruity emerged. A bench marked in the photograph aligned precisely with one of her marginal annotations. Small gestures, tiny shifts in orientation, which might be dismissed as chance, often bear a logic all their own. I paused to observe a young scholar arranging her papers nearby, noting her nervous attention to detail. A faint line of ink smudged across one of Eleanor's pages had gone unnoticed until now. It aligned almost perfectly with a paragraph in the rare book I had just examined. The juxtaposition suggested that Eleanor had been tracking something across both text and score, weaving her observations into a lattice of connections that only someone persistent could untangle. I wandered to the cathedral archives, where the musty smell of damp ledgers and bound reports mingled with the occasional faint hint of tobacco from an earlier reader. One entry caught my eye, an altered financial report, the ink slightly darker in one column. I compared it to Eleanor's notes and saw the faintest pencil mark, a vertical line suggesting she had recognized the discrepancy but was uncertain how to document it. a gesture so slight it might have escaped any ordinary observer, yet for me it formed a vital link between past and present. Later, I reflected on the series of coded notes Eleanor had left in her desk, particularly one marginal addition that referenced a page in the 19th century ledger. The footnote had been overlooked by others, dismissed as incidental. Yet in combination with the photograph, the smudge, and the subtle alignment of benches, a pattern began to emerge. Small gestures, traces of movement, hints of annotation, all intersected to suggest that Eleanor had uncovered something she could neither speak aloud nor trust to be recognized. By dusk, the library was quiet, the corridors echoing only with the distant creak of doors and the occasional shuffle of a lone reader. I left with a sense of anticipation, mingled with melancholy, aware that the footnote, trivial though it seemed, was a hinge upon which the understanding of Eleanor's final days might turn. In Oxford, history and present often overlap. The smallest gesture, the subtlest observation, can illuminate a chain of events that otherwise remains hidden in shadow. The cathedral was quieter than usual that afternoon, the usual murmur of preparation replaced by a tense, almost brittle silence. I walked slowly among the choir stalls, my steps echoing against stone, noting the faint scent of polish and candle wax, and the occasional trace of ink from hurriedly annotated scores. Eleanor Fane's absence seemed to have stretched across the space, leaving a discordant resonance in its wake. Every gesture, every misaligned music stand spoke in the language of unease. I began with the organist, observing him as he methodically adjusted stops and pedals. His face was composed, polite, but there was a tension in the line of his jaw and the way his fingers lingered on the keys. He claimed to recall the rehearsal perfectly, yet a slight hesitation betrayed him when I asked about Eleanor's interaction with the visiting opera coach. Subtle shifts in speech, the fraction of a second before a response, often carry the weight of hidden truths. I noted the exchange carefully, filing away the unspoken alongside what was said. The young soprano moved among the benches, straightening music sheets and adjusting stands with precision that seemed almost anxious. Her eyes flitted constantly toward a corner of the room, where the organist had left a folder, slightly askew. A minor detail, easily overlooked, yet it seemed to flicker with significance. I recalled the faint smudge of ink I had noted in Eleanor's own notes, wondering if these small, overlooked gestures were echoes of the same hidden pattern, like musical motifs repeating under a layer of harmony. I overheard fragments of conversation between two choristers, speaking in low, measured tones about rehearsals that had not taken place, schedules that did not align. The words themselves were innocuous, but their rhythm was off, the emphasis on certain syllables unnatural. In crosswords, I have often found the solution depends not on what is present, but on what is missing. And here, too, absence seemed more telling than any statement. A discarded page fluttered across the floor, partially wet from the drizzle that had seeped in through a corner window. It bore a notation, a minor chord circled twice, a hint that had been overlooked in the morning. The repetition suggested intention rather than accident. I traced the line with my finger, recalling Eleanor's insistence on the same chord in her coded notes. Music, in its most subtle forms, can act as a cipher, conveying anxiety, warning, or concealed meaning. I considered the possibility that she had left instructions or observations embedded within her annotations, a language only the attentive could translate. Later, I examined the ledger again, noting once more the slight discrepancies in entries corresponding to rehearsal dates and donations. When aligned with the musical annotations, a pattern emerged. The moments of dissonance in the schedules coincided with the passages Eleanor had marked most obsessively. Her concerns, previously abstract, began to take shape as a lattice of suspicion and tension intersecting with movements of staff and students alike. I paused in the nave, where the light from tall windows fractured across the polished stone, casting elongated shadows. I observed the choir members leaving, each gesture and glance potentially significant, the tightening of a hand, a slight avoidance of eye contact, a lingering step backward. These subtle movements suggested more than mere fatigue or decorum. They hinted at a network of concealed relationships and concealed anxieties, resonances that were both human and musical. By the time the rehearsal ended, the cathedral was dimming in the muted glow of late afternoon, the faint smell of wet stone and candle smoke lingering. I understood that the discordant harmonies were not merely musical but behavioral, that Eleanor's disappearance had introduced subtle ruptures into the ordinary rhythm of the choir. These fractures, barely perceptible, formed the pattern of motives and hidden tensions that I needed to trace. Somewhere in these overlaps of gesture, annotation, and unsaid words, the next piece of the puzzle awaited recognition. I remember the afternoon as one of those rare moments when the city seemed to hold its breath. Oxford's rooftops glimmered under a hesitant sun, and the faint smell of wet stone mingled with the mustiness of old books. I was retracing Eleanor Fane's steps through the archives, the corridors hushed, the only sounds the soft shuffle of my shoes and the occasional whisper of a page turning. The past had a way of pressing into the present here, and I felt it keenly, as though the walls themselves remembered events more faithfully than those who had lived them. My attention was drawn first to a ledger misplaced for decades, detailing choir finances and donations from an era when the cathedral had been rife with petty rivalries and quiet ambition. A pencil note in Eleanor's hand marked one particular entry. At first glance it seemed an ordinary annotation, but its diagonal alignment with a footnote suggested intentional, deliberate effort to link past and present. In crosswords, I reflected, the smallest intersection often carries the key to the solution. Here, too, overlooked line might illuminate an entire network of motives. I examined an old photograph of the choir, yellowed with age. The positioning of certain hands, the slight lean of heads, even the way the organist had been partially obscured, seemed insignificant. Yet, when aligned with Eleanor's notes, the incongruities suggested more than mere happenstance. Perhaps she had discerned something hidden in these old arrangements, a pattern of rivalry or resentment that had persisted unnoticed. The idea that history echoes in small, almost imperceptible gestures occupied my thoughts as I traced the faint pencil marks. Later, I found a letter folded and stored in a volume of choral essays. It referenced a dispute over scholarships and solo parts from many years past. Eleanor had annotated it with her careful hand, underlining names and dates. A single word she had written at the marginal most illegible seemed to suggest a warning, though its meaning remained elusive. I felt again that familiar tension of the past, exerting influence through subtle signs, leaving fragments that only the patient or observant could decipher. I wandered the cathedral again, moving through cloisters that seemed to stretch with memory. Sunlight through the arches cast long, fractured patterns on the stone floors, as though marking invisible lines of causality. I observed the faint scrape of a bench, the tilt of a music stand left slightly out of alignment, the subtle traces of someone's passage. These were ordinary details, yet in the context of Eleanor's discoveries, they hinted at a network of intentions, a series of interactions spanning decades, all converging upon the present. In the music room, I aligned her coded notes with the ledger entries and photographs. A pattern began to emerge. Sequences in music scores corresponded with financial transactions and seemingly trivial footnotes. Each element reinforced the other, as though Eleanor had been mapping not only her observations, but the persistent, almost imperceptible currents of human behavior. I recalled the minor chord she had emphasized in D minor, the annotation she had circled repeatedly. These were not merely musical choices, but markers, guides through a labyrinth of motives. By late afternoon, the archives were nearly empty. I paused to examine the faintest smudge on the edge of a page, a detail I had overlooked until now. It aligned precisely with the pencil line connecting two seemingly unrelated entries. Such minor clues, invisible to most, had the power to illuminate an entire narrative. I sensed that Eleanor's discoveries, encoded in margins, annotations, and musical markings, were beginning to reveal the extent of ambition, envy, and resentment that had quietly persisted through the years. As I left the building, the sun had dipped low, casting a golden haze over the city. The distant peal of bells carried across rooftops, and I felt, as I often do in Oxford, that the past is never truly gone. Its refrains echo in subtle gestures, in forgotten notes, and in the silences between human words. Eleanor's absence, her coded warnings, and the patterns she had traced all converged in my mind like a motet unfinished, waiting for someone to recognize the harmony within its dissonance. Somewhere in these refrains lay the truth, patient and elusive, demanding careful attention, as all truths must. I arrived at the cathedral that evening with the sun low and waning, casting long shadows across the nave. The air smelled faintly of damp stone and polished wood, tinged with the residual scent of incense. The quiet was almost unbearable, the usual low hum of activity absent, replaced by an expectant hush. I carried Eleanor Fane's notes and annotations with me, each page heavy with the weight of absence, each marking a fragment of a story that had yet to be fully understood. I paused at the choir stalls, noting the slight misalignment of one stand, the scuff of a shoe where someone had lingered too long. These minor details, which might be dismissed by a casual observer, flickered in importance under careful scrutiny. They were gestures, subtle but deliberate, traces of the human presence Eleanor had left behind, and perhaps hints pointing toward the truth she could not speak aloud. The organist appeared, his expression carefully neutral, though I sensed the tightness around his eyes and jaw. I asked him to recount the final rehearsal, and he did so with politeness, yet there were omissions, pauses where clarity should have been. The young soprano lingered nearby, her gaze flicking toward a corner of the room, and I observed the faint tightening of her hands, the almost imperceptible shift of weight. These gestures, unremarkable in isolation, suggested a network of unspoken alliances and anxieties, a lattice connecting action and intention. I spread Eleanor's coded notes across the music bench, overlaying them with her annotations in the scores. The sequences in D minor, the diagonal lines in her margin, the repeated emphasis on certain passages, all converged to reveal a subtle pattern. The music itself had been a cipher, a way to map interactions, record observations, and highlight discrepancies in behavior and accounts. I traced a particular line connecting ledger entries, rehearsal notes, and photograph markings. The puzzle was almost complete, the final note waiting to be recognized by the careful observer. I paused to observe a minor detail, a smudge of ink on the edge of a page, aligning precisely with a diagonal line in her annotations. At first it seemed trivial, an accident, yet in the context of all else it became a marker, a deliberate signpost pointing to a discrepancy in the reported movements of one of the staff. I remembered a crossword clue I had once struggled with. Sometimes the answer lies in the margin, in what is barely noticed. Here, too, the smallest gesture illuminated a thread that connected past and present. I reconstructed the timeline of Eleanor's last day, noting inconsistencies between statements, rehearsal records, and her own coded notes. The subtle divergences suggested more than misremembering. They hinted at deliberate manipulation, concealment of encounters, and the quiet exercise of influence. Each minor observation, from the placement of benches to the faint perfume lingering in a corner, contributed to an overarching structure I could finally begin to see. By twilight, I had gathered the key figures within the cathedral, drawing them into a quiet room where the last echoes of the day settled around us. I recounted the patterns, the hidden harmonies and dissonances that Eleanor had recorded, each observation leading inexorably to a single conclusion. The revelation was neither dramatic nor violent in delivery. It emerged gently, logically, almost as though the cathedral itself had guided the discovery, its stone and air bearing silent witness to the unfolding truth. When the explanation was complete, I lingered alone in the nave, letting the quiet wash over me. The candles flickered, the stone walls absorbed the last rays of daylight, and I allowed myself a brief reflection on the melancholy that accompanies resolution. Eleanor's voice, absent yet resonant through her notes and the traces she left, seemed to linger in the finality of the space, a haunting reminder of ambition, caution, and the subtle intersections of human intention. I left the cathedral with the chill of evening brushing against my coat, aware that while the case had reached its logical conclusion, the echoes remained. The last note had been played, but the resonance persisted, faint yet insistent, as if reminding me that in Oxford, as in music, the end is rarely absolute, and the beauty of the melody lingers long after the final chord has sounded.